Hi, Julia.
Hi.
How are you?
Not too bad. We finally got decent weather outside, but
Yeah. What's the temperature there?
I think it's almost 40.
Yeah, we're glad because it's 50. I think back down in New York, it's 60.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yep, 43 it says. Yep. I'll take it.
You have a lot of snow out there?
Not where we are. We have a lot. We have patchy. It's more like ice now at this point. It's like the crusty snow and or ice that is hopefully melting soon because you can't do anything with it. Can't walk on it. Can't nothing.
So you're good for putting things in the chat?
The only question I had was, do you want the whole chunk in one chat blurb for each of the slides, or do you want it like broken up across, like in several chat blurb, whatever?
Like maybe as we say things.
Okay.
Oh. I got this new like camera holder. Hi, Josh.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Joanna.
Hi, Joanna.
Yeah, so I got this new like thing to hold my camera, so I'm trying to fake eye contact. I don't know. Am I looking at you? It feels so weird.
No, because mine's up on top of my computer, so I always look like I'm almost never looking at the camera. I'm looking at the faces, right? So I did a Zoom interview for something, and I have a tripod that I can use when I'm using the camera off my, and I set the tripod up so that I could look at the pictures behind it and look like I was looking at the people who were interviewing me.
Right. It's yeah. No, I have this camera like right in front of my screen.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Hi, Julie. Hi, Dina.
Hello. How is everyone?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I figured you all would want to make sure that I was here and ready. So I am here. I am also going to go get my mom's dog really quick from the yard so that he's not crying. So I'm going to turn off my camera and my audio, but wanted you all to be like, she's here, she's cool, she's good. I will be right back.
Joanna, do you want to turn off the recording?
Sure.
Time being.
All right, should we get started?
So I think we've got people coming in. Everybody's in. Yeah. Are we recording? Yep, we are. Okay.
Yes.
I was looking for my little record.
All right. Hello and welcome to Taking a Moment, reflecting on our DEAI responsibilities, hosted by the Independent Museum Professionals. This session is being recorded. I'm Joanna Goldfeld. I'm an independent graphic and exhibit designer based usually in Brooklyn, New York.
I'm Julie Govert. I am an independent exhibit developer and writer based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm happy to say it's almost 60 degrees and sunny here and the snow is melting. Also, we have with us helping, we have Bart Hayes, Julia Gray, Laura Roberts, who are all IMPs, as well as Josh Warren from AAM helping us with this session.
And so before we start, we wanted to share a little bit about the Independent Museum Professionals. IMP is AAM's professional network of consultants and freelancers who work in all areas of museums and with all types of museums. Our network provides a central hub of resources, knowledge, connections, And we actively work to support independent museum professionals, strengthen the relationship between independent museum professionals and museums, and advance the museum field. If you're interested in joining the independent museum professionals, we'll have more information at the end of this session on how. All right, well, we hope you'll meet some great people in this session, and we want you to be able to connect. So we're putting a link to a contact sheet in the chat. You can add your information and choose to share with other program participants, join the Independent Museum Professionals mailing list, and express interest in volunteering. For those wanting to share contact info with other participants, we'll compile and distribute a list after the session so you can easily connect directly with anyone you meet.
So a little bit about this program. This is actually a repeat of a program that we did last November with Dina Bailey of Mountaintop Vision about diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. If you joined us for that, you know, we had a little bit of Zoom difficulty and we wanted to make sure that we gave this topic the time and space that it deserved. So we've actually made this program a little bit longer. It's a 90-minute program, and some people miss it. So we just wanted to really provide that opportunity to have some productive discussions around this topic. So in a 2018 report by AAM's Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Working Group, they said diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion are essential, sustainable values for museums to pursue. These principles are not only bedrocks of ethical and morally courageous museum work, but they also signal how the field can remain relevant to an ever diversifying US population. So we're going to talk about that today, and we're going to hopefully walk away with some practical guidance on what our responsibilities as independent museum professionals are and how we can effectively contribute to much needed systemic change in our field. And to lead us, I'm really thrilled to have Dina back with us. Dina Bailey is the CEO of Mountaintop Vision. She's a member of IMP's steering committee and also serves on has served on AAM's DEAI working group. Mountaintop Vision is a consulting firm that works with and supports organizations as they conduct difficult conversations related to race, figure out how to consistently center on inclusion in decision-making processes and action, and generate positive systemic change. Dina has over 15 years of experience in formal and informal education, including stints at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center and the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. And she combines research in empathy, bias, diversity, equity, and inclusion with strategies and techniques from the fields of education, anthropology, and transitional justice. So thank you, Dina, for joining us again. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I can get to it and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and welcome to everyone. Welcome back to everyone. And thank you for the wonderful introduction that allows me just to jump right into things, hopefully, recognizing that we've still got some folks joining us. We'll be using the chat function a lot. We'll also be doing some breakout rooms. How many depends a little bit on you all and how much conversation we have going already. And so I just wanted to recognize that as we move forward. Also, thank you for any of you who wrote in questions at the time of registration. I've added answers to some of those questions just throughout the PowerPoint presentation, the slide deck, but also we'll try to make some space specifically at the end as well. So feel free to put questions in the chat. If I see them, I'll try to answer them in the moment. If I don't see them, feel free to repaste them at the end. We'll get to some questions then as well. So welcome to everyone. I'm going to share my screen here. And in this moment, will you just give me a thumbs up? It could be an actual thumbs up. It could be a reaction button, just to make sure that you all can see my screen. Perfect. We will get started then. Thank you for that. The first focus area that we have is just to say we all need to take a minute, right? When we are talking about DEAI and the responsibilities that we have, I think that sometimes it can be really overwhelming. The context within which we're all living right now, multiple pandemics, there's a lot happening. And so we just need to take a moment and recognize that moment to take a breath, right? That moment to reflect. So that's the first section that we're really going to get into here. And in that, I want everyone to think about how they are feeling in this moment, right? So how are you feeling in this moment? So on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being, I feel amazing, this is the best day, and 1 being, I'm completely exhausted, I could barely get on this Zoom call. How are you feeling? Go ahead and put that in the chat. Right. 5 is high, 1 is low. Thank you for these coming in. It's always helpful to know where people are starting. All right, as we've got a couple more coming in here, I just want to recognize with my next slide that we all need to be thinking about mindfulness a little bit more. Right? We need to be thinking about how to be present, how to be intentional, whatever mindfulness means to you. For me, it is going out in nature, taking space to kind of reevaluate, be present, level set for myself. So I put that picture in there. But for others, I think it would be really helpful just to know where we have similarities and differences already. So just quickly in the chat to get us using that chat box, what is your definition of mindfulness, right? It could be an actual definition. It could be an example like mine. Let's just go ahead and share those quickly. What does mindfulness mean to you? Great. And if you've already put something in, just take a moment to look through others as well, because it might be something that you consider an everyday occurrence is really mindfulness for someone else. And that can be really helpful as you're thinking about what you need to do. All right, perfect. I also think it's really important to think about intentionality. Sometimes these are guiding principles, sometimes they're called group agreements or working agreements. But for me, it's really important to put these out there and also for us to all hold ourselves accountable to them. And so for accessibility reasons, but also for intentionality reasons, I'm going to read these out loud. Right? So the first one, be curious and open. I think that curiosity leads to knowledge, knowledge leads to more empathy, and empathy leads to positive actions, hopefully. So thinking about being really curious and being really open to whatever gets shared today. Second, listen for understanding and check your assumptions. A lot of times we are just prepared to reply. We're thinking about our reply or a reaction. We're also thinking about, oh, I know where that person's experience has been, or I think I know that's just because they grew up in this generation or this geographic area. So really in this moment, make sure that you are checking your own assumptions about things, but you're also listening for the understanding and not just for the reply. Recognize that this is not a debate. I think that a lot of times people, when talking about diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, they want to debate definitions, debate which one is most fundamental. There are lots of things that people want to win, right? In terms of winning people over to their side. That's not what this is about. It's just about sharing information and experiences and even assumptions so that we can learn more about ourselves and each other in this process as we're thinking about responsibility. Be patient and bring your whole self. In having these conversations, I also often hear people asking for what happens at the end. What are my checkpoints? What are the things that I can do next? How can I check things off the box? Just recognize that this process of talking to each other, of listening, of being here in this moment, even just the mindfulness space, right, is part of the journey that we're on. And so be patient, but bring your entire self to this. Some of us are here from a work setting, right? Some of us are here on our own personal journey. And so we bring all of the aspects of both work and home into what we talk about when we're discussing diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. Try to acknowledge when you are uncomfortable. Discomfort is something that I think is pretty normal, is pretty natural, right? As we're thinking about change. And when we talk about diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, often we are talking about aspects of change. And so in that, if we're too comfortable, we might be thinking about the fact that we need coffee or that it's lunchtime. If we're too uncomfortable, all we can think about is how uncomfortable we are, right? So be mindful of what your comfort level is, what your emotions currently are. That doesn't mean that you shut down, but it does mean that you might do some things to mitigate that, right? Turn your screen off for a moment, step away from your desk, stand up and shake yourself out. All of those types of things can be really impactful. And last but not least, be open to changing your mind. I think that as young people, as children, we are very excited to bring information in and change our minds about things as we hear new information. Sometimes as adults, whatever we say first is the thing that we think we have to stick with, right? And so just saying, I'm open to changing my mind gives me a mindset that I can change it. I can listen to what others say or even what I am saying and tweak, right? How I feel about things, how I understand things, how I see myself in the world. So if there are any questions about those, any need for clarification, please feel free to put that in the chat. But otherwise, if you would just in the chat say, yes, okay, got it, whatever you want to say to show that you will hold yourself and others accountable during the time that we have together. All right, so just put something in, thank you, to say, I'm on board if you are willing to hold yourself accountable to these things and others as well. Perfect. Thank you so much. And just as a side note, I think that these are really good, whether you're using these bullet points or others, to do group agreements or guiding principles at the beginning of most or all of your meetings. I have organizations that just put them up in their conference room as reminders every meeting. All right, our next focus area is about shared understandings, and I'm hoping to go through these relatively quickly. This is really about DEAI responsibilities within the organization, but as part of that, I want to make sure that we have a really solid foundation upon which to build. So we need to do that for this section. I am a big fan of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, which is housed at the Ohio State University. So you may see that coming up. If not, go check them out at some point. They've got a lot of great resources. But when we're thinking about implicit bias in particular, right, you'll see that there are attitudes, stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So even just with this, I want to recognize the unconscious or implicit aspect of this. Everyone has biases, right? When I was early on in my consulting career, I used to have people raise their hand and say, do you think you're biased? And people would keep their hands down. Everyone has biases. Judges, police officers, teachers, I'm like nannies, everyone has biases, right? Museum workers. And so thinking about that and how they show up, most of what we are reacting to or behaviors come from that unconscious or implicit space. right? So they have both favorable and unfavorable assessments. Often we think about bias with a negative connotation, but they can be favorable as well. And they're also without our awareness or an intentional control. And so as we think about implicit bias, the changes that we need to potentially make is becoming more aware of them, right? Once they go into our conscious, we get curious about them, then we can more intentionally change them, right? The other thing to note about bias, I think implicit bias in particular, is that our stated values or our stated beliefs may not actually be in alignment with our implicit values and beliefs as part of bias. So just because you say, of course, I love people of color, or I think millennials are great, right? If you're saying that out loud, that doesn't necessarily mean that your brain, right, your implicit bias is in alignment or in connection with that. And so I just very much want to recognize everyone has them. We all need to work on them in different ways, in different spaces, in different moments, right? Next up, for definitions of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, people put them in different orders, which is completely fine. I've used AAM's definitions here, which are probably fairly familiar to folks. But just to emphasize, as people are potentially reading the definitions, when we're thinking about diversity, it really is a state of being, right? And so in thinking about diversity, it's not a euphemism for people of color or Black people or racial diversity. Often that is kind of the connection that we make, but really diversity can be so many different things, right? Learning style, right-handed, left-handed, right-brained, left-brained, ability, orientation, lots of things make up diversity, right? So think about a state of being. Diversity is important. It is not the end all and be all of what we need to be talking about. For equity, we're often using equity and equality synonymously. And so just as a very kind of surface level discussion of it, equality is when we say we want fair and just treatment of all members, but we're going to give everyone the same thing in order to be fair. When we talk about equity, we're saying we want fair and just treatment for all of our members, and we recognize the past exclusion that people have had and that people have different resource needs. So we're not going to give everyone exactly the same thing because people have different needs, right? So when we're thinking about equality and equity, make sure you know the difference in what you're talking about and use that with intention. Accessibility, often we are connecting that to ADA compliance, right? Are the doors wide enough? Do we have Braille? Do we have an audio guide? Those types of things. In recognizing accessibility, as AAM has put it forward, really honing in on that idea of a continuum of human ability and experience. And so recognizing, for example, that if you've done research and everyone within your zip code only makes a median of $20,000 a year, then maybe, again, in terms of equity, you say for everyone in this zip code, we're going to make our institution more accessible. And so everyone within the zip code gets in for free, and everyone outside of the zip code maybe has to pay $10. Right? So you see how equity is playing into that difference in experience, that continuum of experience that I'm talking about. And then with inclusion, this is the intentional ongoing effort, right? And so this is really important as we move forward to make sure that inclusion isn't divorced from all of the other aspects, that you have to continuously work on this, that it has to be intentional, that it's about decision-making and power and equity, right, as we're moving through this space. So I want to point out DEAI because I think these days we often just lump them all together and we don't necessarily think about what each means individually and how they work as a system. right? All right. And then also thinking about the fact that DEAI, anti-racism are not the same thing. So as we've discussed, DEAI is this broader idea, right? I explained all of those. I won't go back, but racism is specific to race. And so anti-racism is specific to race as well. And sometimes when I'm doing trainings or talking to people about trainings, they say that they want to have an anti-racism training, right? But then in the actual training, people are saying, well, what about sexism? What about classism, right? And so how are we talking about intersectionality? Of course, but also do we know what we want, right? When we say we want to focus on anti-racism, or we want to focus on DEAI work, or we want to focus on decolonization, right? That's a different one. So it might be a Venn diagram where they overlap, but make sure that you're using the language, you're using the vocabulary with the intentions that you have, right? And then here, I'll just pause us in saying that I've used racism specifically because I just gave that description of anti-racism, but it can go for any oppressive system. That the thing that we catch on the cell phone or that moment that we see something sexist happening, there's a lot under that, right? There's a lot of structure, there's a lot of socialization, there's a lot of implicit bias. So we're only seeing a particular moment, but we know we need to know and recognize that there's a lot underneath that. The other thing I think that is really important, specifically in the United States, to be talking about is the fact that these oppressive systems and racism in particular have been happening since the country or before the country was created here. And so in doing that, sometimes it seems that racism is actually more the norm than anti-racism in terms of policies and actors. Right. And that can be really trying for people. So I'm going to pause in a second here. But this idea that racism is actually more of a standard than anti-racism. And so it is harder for us to make change, anti-racist change because of that, because it's been happening for centuries. And that can also be true for other oppressive systems that we can name as well. All right. Okay, so here's where we are going to try our first chat breakout groups. So we're going to break into groups where we have hopefully about 4 people per group. We're going to break out for 10 minutes and recognizing that that's not a lot of time. I want to make sure that you all are sharing the space as much as possible, right? And so the question is just going to be really simple. How does your organization or the organizations that you work with okay, so how does your organization or the organizations that you work with utilize DEAI language, anti-racism language, and or decolonization language? Okay, so how does your organization or the organizations you work with utilize DEAI, anti-racism, and or decolonization language? Hopefully I spelled everything correctly. Want to make sure that that is in the chat for you as you move into your breakouts, right? So 10 minutes and you all, my helpful folks, I think it's, we can move right into those breakouts. Open those avenues, please. Wonderful. Welcome back as you all are coming back. I recognize that 10 minutes is not nearly enough time, so I apologize for that, but hopefully it just gets conversations started. I think that's really important, right? I also recognize that we don't have time for all of the groups to share out. I think that there were 16 groups, But at the same time, sharing is a really important way to gather affirmation, but think about things differently and sort of hone in on how you feel about things or the things that you know. So just as I'm kind of moving through the next transition of slides, if folks want to write in things that were really curious or resonated or were still confusing, anything that you want to share with others in the chat that might be helpful for them, right? Even if it's not necessarily a win or something super constructive, I think anything you want to share in the chat could be really helpful to folks. So I encourage you to do that based on the conversations that you had. All right, so just as we're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen again. All right, in sharing my screen, our next area of focus is about responsibility. So if we're recognizing the complexity of diversity, equity, access, inclusion, racism and anti-racism, colonization and decolonization, all of the other oppressive systems that we can and should be talking about as well, if we build that foundation, the more we are aware, the more we have responsibility to do things, right? Hopefully everyone agrees with that. And so in focusing on our responsibilities, I want to talk about leadership. Leadership is different from management. And I always try to express that because I think these days, again, in other fields, but in the museum field especially, we have made them synonymous. The leadership team, or going back and forth between leadership and management. But those are really two different things. And so in thinking about leadership, putting forth a vision, help getting people to embrace that vision and move forward, you can do that at any position, right? You can do that at any level and any department of your organization. I recognize that some people feel like they have more power or advantage than others. Some people have disadvantage, not a lot of agency. That's a reality, right? But just the idea that you can be a leader, I want that to be something that we take away as well. So in this first slide here about our responsibilities, you have a responsibility to lead through agility. I think that as I was originally putting the slide deck together, we were in the heaviest part perhaps of quarantine. It is still very true today and maybe true in a slightly different way, but agility in leadership within our organizations is very important. And as you'll note here, accountability culture, right? So some of you had questions about how do I get people to do things? How do we keep moving this forward? Accountability is a big part of that, right? Empowering people at all levels, talking about what leadership means in different areas and how it shows up in different ways is a really important part of making change and continuing it forward, right? Agreements depending on integrity. I think that when push comes to shove in these conversations, we so often think about, yes, I believe that in theory, right? We leave the words in theory off. We just say, I believe in that. When it comes to practical application, right? When it comes to the realities of what we'll have to sacrifice or what we might need to sunset, that's where we start running up against resistance. And so thinking about making your agreements based on the integrity of saying, this is what I've said I value, this is what I said I believe, this is what I've said I'm committed to in theory. Now let's make sure that we are putting actions to this, right? And we're holding ourselves accountable. And as part of that, there is this trust equation, right? So you have to have credibility, reliability, and intimacy and self-orientation as part of that trust equation. Without trust in the organization, you won't be able to move things forward, or you won't be able to move things forward as quickly and effectively as you'd like. I have a lot of organizations where the staff is really skeptical of what that senior team is doing or what the board is doing. And so how do you show folks that you have credibility, reliability, and that intimacy and self-orientation? And in that, right, I think that there needs to be some transparency and some healing that is done, because there are an awful lot of senior teams and executive directors and board members who, again, will say behind closed doors, I recognize that we haven't done these specific things well, but it's much more difficult to name that for staff, right? And how do we push that forward? Next, I think about leading through resilience. Again, something that was very pertinent in the midst of the pandemic and continues to be today. Life doesn't come with a map, right? Even if we create a roadmap for ourselves, we don't know when we'll have to take a detour. We don't know when there will be construction in the middle of our path, right? And so recognizing that resilience is not just about how you get up if you fall down, right? Using that analogy, but it's what you do in those moments. So we all have trauma. That's another thing that I think we only talk about in terms of extremes. But if you think about it as a trauma bucket, we all have trauma that is put into our bucket on a daily basis, right? Some of us have more in our bucket than others. Some are able to scoop some of that trauma out, but we all have it. And so as we're thinking about resilience, it's recognizing, to use a different analogy, again, that falling down analogy, to say, why did I fall down? What lessons can I learn from falling down? How do I make sure that I don't fall down again in the same way, right? So resilience is not just about getting back up, not just about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It's also about saying, in that area of personal growth, what happened? How can I ensure it doesn't happen again? What can I do differently next time, right? And having the confidence that you are making changes, right? Not just reflecting on the past, but thinking about the present and the future as well. Leading through empowerment is the third one. And so when I say empowerment at all levels, right, in that agility space, when I talk about empowerment through resilience, that I have the confidence that I can do something, that I have some type of agency, some type of power, even if it's soft power, right, or positional power. When I'm thinking about empowerment, I'm thinking about prioritizing connections, relationships, and partnerships. So some of the questions that folks had from the registration said, how do I not do this all myself? How do I bring others on with me? Does it have to start as an institution-wide thing, or can we ripple out? Right? So thinking about what connections we have as individuals, how we can utilize this within organizations or the organizations that we work with, how we can create partnerships amongst ourselves as consultants, right? What we can do in that space. I have as a second bullet point, taking care of your mind, your body, and your spirit. This, I'm sure, has come up for many of us, working really long hours, not working a lot of hours, what that does to our minds, to our bodies, and to our spirits. And that might look really different for all of you, right? We may be very diverse and unique in that way, but thinking about not just when using another analogy, right? Not just when you have a boiling pot of water, turning it down so it's not quite boiling, but how do we figure out how to turn things all the way off, right? Or how to turn them down to a simmer, I think is really important. And that's about your mind, your body, and your spirit work. Finding your purpose, I think, is really important as well. Again, as independent consultants, we've probably gotten into this area of the field for a particular reason. For me, I was always an educator. I was a high school English teacher before. I moved into education in the museum field. I now am doing consulting work. And so education has always been a purpose. Talking about race and racism, talking about DEAI as the language has changed and evolved, it's always been part of my purpose. That doesn't mean, however, that it's not exhausting or overwhelming or depressing or any of those things, right? We have to separate out our purpose from the need to take care of ourselves, I think. And so figuring out what honest self-care looks like for you is really important in that. And then embracing that everyone is doing their best, I think, is a really important thing to think about and to delve into. Again, for those of us who are consultants on this call, or independent museum professionals, or we're even working within an organization, sometimes we can be really critical, and we're saying they're not getting where they need to be. They're not moving fast enough. The executive director isn't putting his money where his mouth is, right? We can talk about critiquing what people are doing and what they're not doing. If we embrace that everyone is doing their best in the moment, that provides grace, right? That gives people a little bit of grace to say, even if they're not doing what I think they should be doing, even if I don't think they're reaching their potential, I have no idea what's happening in their minds. I have no idea what hardships they might be going through in various spaces. And so recognizing that everyone is doing their best gives that grace. At the same time, when we know better, we can do better, right? So that isn't saying everyone's off the hook for things that have happened in our lives, those traumas at work or at home, but recognizing kind of the two sides of that coin there. All right. And then last but not least in this section, I want us also to be really realistic. And again, I'm not saying this as a way to give an excuse or to separate people out from responsibility. I'm actually talking about it in terms of DEAI responsibility, that we have to be really clear about what we can control, what we can influence, and what we have an invested interest in. All right. So sometimes we think that we have more control over a situation when actually we have some influence over it, right? Or we might think that we're really invested in something, and so that means that we have influence or control. And in reality, we just care a lot about it, right? And so as we're thinking about change for diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, anti-racism and decolonization in our work, being really clear on where we have control, right? What decisions can we make? How can we support other people? When we think about vendors, when we think about other consultants, when we think about people who are on panels, those kinds of things. When do we have the control? And so what responsibility do we have in that area? When do we have influence, but not necessarily control, right? So that we can support or we can lend if we have advantage or privilege in a particular area. What can we do to have that influence? And maybe that then leads to more control, right? How can we be strategic in that responsibility? And then sometimes we're just really invested in something again. And so recognizing that those are different things, that just because we care about something doesn't mean that we can particularly make the change within a particular organization or a community aspect. Again, in terms of responsibility, how do we move from investment to influence to control? I think that's a really important question. Right. So I'm going to pause my screen again here. Right. Thank you for the folks who put some things into the chat. Again, providing a little bit more time for people to put things into the chat from their first breakout session, because I want to make sure that we move into a second breakout session here about responsibility. Right. So as folks, if you were paying attention and you didn't want to disrupt anything, just take a few minutes to put something into the chat if you have something that you want to add. And then we're going to talk about responsibility within those breakouts, and specifically where you think you have control, where you think you have influence, and where you think you have investment in the organization that you're working within or the organizations that you're working with. All right, so let me just give a second here. Does anyone have a question as we are kind of infiltrating things into the chat or infiltrating in terms of getting ready for our breakouts? Is there a specific question anyone has? All right. We will hold that until we come back, right? And so recognizing, again, I'll just try and put it here quickly. I'm just going to put the words so that you remember. What do we have control over? What do we have influence over? And what do we have investment in when it comes to the organization in which we are working or the organizations that we work with? So again, you're going to have 10 minutes. You will be in groups of approximately 4, but they will be groups different from the ones that you had in our first breakout. All right, so go ahead and open those rooms, please, and we will see you back in a little bit. Welcome back, welcome back. All right, as folks continue to come in, again, I think it would be wonderful if we could put some things in the chat, just things that resonated that you were talking about. You don't have to have the answer to everything. Just say, this is what my group was talking about. I think that's really important as folks continue forward. And so as we're doing that, right, it is 3:06 now. I want to make sure that we have some time for Q&A for the things that I didn't get to cover that were in the registered questions, but also things that maybe have come up now as well, right? So as we are doing this, I'm going to add in, so as you all are saying the things that you shared, I'm going to add 2 things to share as well. So one of them, that first Google Drive doc, is a continuum of anti-racist organization, right? So you can work with organizations to say, where do you fall on this continuum? And let's think about how to move forward. And the other one I'm going to share is an article called Detour Spotting by Joan Olson. And so it also talks about the ways in which we try to detour out of conversations of conflict, right? So it can be really helpful when we're having these conversations that we recognize when someone is trying to veer off of that path, right? To shut down a conversation. So those are the 2 things that I'm adding here. And recognizing what we have so far in the chat, talking about ownership versus hiding or erasing mistakes, the art of listening to new and sometimes younger voices, influence, being okay with starting small and tackling steps, listening and asking great questions, less control and maybe some influence than perhaps we thought. Consultants, we actually have more influence than we think, right? We've been hired as experts, and how do we use that advantage, right? How do we use that to our advantage? Wonderful. Please do continue to have these conversations. I am going to also just do this now so that we don't run out of time and I don't forget, but I want to make sure that I send you all the slide deck as well. So everyone who is stuck around here with me, because we're not going to get to everything in the slide deck. There were things that I skipped and things that I wanted to talk about otherwise. So I'll put that in here now as well, just to make sure that you all have that. But as I'm doing that, why don't we put in some questions that you have had, right? You can speak up. You can take yourself off mute at this point, I think, or you could put it in the chat. But what are some questions that you don't feel like have been answered yet and you could use our support?
Hi. My name is Rachel. I'm in Monterey, California. I was curious about more resources, for best hiring practices for this. You know, I think as a white person, I worry sometimes about tokenizing, you know, various people, and while trying to hire and make my team. So any resources that you might have on ways to keep improving that process. And then also, I was telling my group, I kind of am a typical museum person where I worked my way from unpaid internships and kept working up. So I was kind of that base level ticketing employee. And I never felt like I actually had a voice, as outspoken as I was, and as passionate as I was. So how more resources I can pass on to potentially people that work for me or when I'm in another institution about how they can lead from below, you know, when they're not in the leadership tier, how they can invest and lead from more of the bottom of the totem pole when they're not in a decision-making position, if that makes sense.
Wow. And everyone else, feel free to add in if you have resources and thoughts as well. That would be fabulous. I see that Nicole already put in a good resource for hiring. So everybody, this is our moment to share. I think that's really important. One of the things that I would say quickly as well is that I think that when we're talking, when we go back to DEAI responsibilities, right, we're really thinking about inclusion and equity, again, not just in racial terms, as I hear so often, but we're talking about experience and youth and gender and all of those aspects as well. So one of the things, Rachel, that I think that you bring up as a reminder to everyone is that when we're thinking about the work that needs to be done, that also includes bringing in people from the forward-facing staff or bringing in new employees to be talking about things. I'm always asking for people to have panels in terms of interviews, right? As we think about bias, but also allowing for more of those young voices perhaps to be in the room as well. I think it's about leading through action. And so how do you bring young folks into the space? How do you make space for them? I think that it goes back to some of that stuff we talked about in theory and in practice, right? And so as you're thinking about how you want to lift as you climb, what does that look like? So I'm giving that general guidance. I also see that Laura Roberts put in something about the governance gap and diversifying boards, kind of where that starts. Also recognizing that diversity is not enough, right? We can't just add in aspects of diversity and think that we are good to go. So I will, and this is for everyone, putting in my email address here. I've got some specific things that I can share with you if you send me an email, but for the large group, I'll put together some resources particular to hiring and send those through if we have a listserv to that as well. Thank you.
Hello, this is Rita Diedrich, and I actually have a comment for Rachel. May I?
Of course.
Okay, great. And hello, Rachel. Rachel and I just started volunteering together on something, so it's so good to see you. And I'll just be quick, but I was at the museum that I was laid off from for over 20 years, starting entry level and going into a senior position, although not executive. And I think something to think about is for a lot of the entry level positions, it's very operational. And so it's hard to think about leadership in a more conceptual level. So something you said, Dina, about action, absolutely. But action and leadership sometimes is very nuanced and much more subtle than it is when you are a person who has the kind of position where you're really frontline operations. And so don't ever give up on being that leader from no matter what level, but do learn how to do that in a way that may be much more nuanced than you're used to operating. Those are my sage words.
They were great sage words. Wonderful. Others, do you have questions, or you can also comment as well? Again, we're here to help each other.
Dina, I would just want one of the things, having looked at some of the questions beforehand that people put in registration, was just, how do we get beyond, while being patient and going through the process, but how do we get beyond just thinking and talking about it to actually taking steps, real actionable steps to achieve these things?
Yeah, so one of the first things that I would say in terms of that is I talk a lot about action plans and creating action plans with organizations. Again, I'd be happy to send a template along for how I think about impacts and then the tactics that people are using to get to those impacts and responsibility. But just very generally, in terms of creating those actions and accountability, think about it like a strategic plan. I think that so often, because we get nervous about DEAI and we think that it's really an abstract thing, or it's a point of tension, or all of the words and all of the things that we connect to DEAI, we stop thinking about it like we would with any other aspect of a strategic plan. And so really working within your organization to say, okay, what are the 3 priorities that we have? If hiring is one of those priorities, what are the 4 actions that we are going to take, right? What are our strategies? How are we going to ensure those tactics? Who is responsible for this thing, right? When are we going to get it done? And like with strategic planning, you can't just say it's ongoing work, as we tend to do with DEAI as well, right? You have to have times, you have to have phases. So that would be something I think that would be just kind of off the bat, thinking about, if we want change, we don't just want it to be in terms of talk, we have to figure out how to set accountability. And I say that in terms of the action plan or the strategic plan, but also that it's very much about your policies and procedures as well, right? So if you actually put DEAI strategies or expectations into your performance goals at the beginning of the year when you're working with organizations, then you can do it as part of your performance evaluation. If during orientation, everyone has to do something, or onboarding, everyone has to do something, right? So how do you interweave DEAI into these strategic things that you're already doing? That will get the action, right, that you may lack, because it's not what we're doing above, right? It's what we're doing within or at the same time. And I think that often people think, oh, we have to add money and we have to spend more time. But really, it's about thinking about how you weave these into communication and exhibition prep and mid-year reviews, all of those things that you're hopefully already doing. As we're talking, I'll see if I can pull one of those up for you all. What other questions or thoughts have come up that you don't think got answered yet?
So there's a question from Gail in the chat asking if you have any thoughts about how to address DEAI strategies in the design of exhibits and how an IMP might be influential without having specific control.
So when I work with people who are doing exhibitions in particular, I start off with just, again, as we all do in the process, I really start off with what is the overarching narrative that we're trying to tell. And then we have conversations about what biases we may have as part of that narrative. Who are we centering, right? So then there can be conversations about whiteness. Who have we brought into the conversation? So then we can start to think about accessibility and inclusion. Having conversations, even again at the very beginning, about equity, and in terms of content, what are we willing to raise and let go, right? In terms of making sure that we're being equitable, but also in terms of resources. What does that look like? What are we willing to give a little bit more to, a little less to? I think that also comes up when we're talking about sponsors, even when we're talking about marketing for the exhibition. The talking points that you have, who have you shown those to? Have you had any focus groups about them? Have you ensured that your bias or your centering isn't on top of that? When you're thinking about marketing dollars, are you just using the same marketing outlets that you always use? Where could it be different, right? So again, kind of that conversation of whatever the general standard process is, how do you go back and look at that and add these aspects into each one of those conversations? And it should, people talk about it taking longer, right? But the more you have those conversations, actually the faster you can go, because so often exhibitions get stalled because they haven't been transparent, they haven't asked people. And so you get way into it and then have to reverse. Right? I also think, just really quickly to Gail as well, so many of the organizations that I am working with have been that curator-led, like solo kind of thing that everybody else's support for, and really trying to move into cross-functional, cross-departmental work projects, right? So from the very beginning, we're all working together rather than waiting until everything's done and telling the educators or the programmers to jump in. Right? I think that's really important to your question too.
Another question that jumped out to me from some of the earlier questions on registration were, how do we gain allies, and how do we engage with diverse community partners without like putting the burden back on them, that emotional burden, getting that input.
I think that people need, and again, this is nothing that you all haven't heard before, everybody needs to do their own work, right? And so the less work you do, the more you lean on other people. Because you're not confident about a particular thing, you're nervous about the way it's going to come across, or there are lots of reasons, and I'm not judging any of them. But I think that the more work you do as an individual, the more confident you are in what you know and what you don't know, and the more humble you can be in having those conversations with others. Right? I think it's also about making that space, using those guiding principles as I used in the very beginning, making that space to be really clear and transparent in saying to people, hey, listen, this is the work that we're doing. It's not the work that the people of color on our team are doing. Actually, just naming that and saying that can build a lot of trust and also build some expectations as well. Hopefully that was helpful.
If I may just add to that, something I recently learned. I consulted with a man named Dina, who is a museum consultant on accessibility. I see some nods. So he is so cool. And I asked him about website accessibility because he's IT. He's also blind. And he mentioned, we were so worried about the website being accessible. And he said, communities just also appreciate the transparency, like Dina said. He said, put a disclaimer on the front page that says, we know our website isn't fully accessible. We are working towards this. If you would like to volunteer, reach out to us to help with this project, depending on what your organization is, let us know, and we would love to. So sometimes just even calling out, he said, the gaps and the missing pieces, and committing to working on it is also really great transparency and still makes communities feel heard.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. And to jump off of you and what Dina said too, I think the other side of that is when people are willing to help, let them help. Right. So I can't tell you how many times I've been willing to do something and someone has said to me like, well, I don't want to tokenize you. And I'm like, if I felt tokenized, I wouldn't offer to do something for you. Right. And so if people are genuinely offering something, accept that as what it is. Because I'm like, I have a finite amount of time, but if I feel strongly enough about it and I'm willing to help you, I will. And so I think that asking and that accepting is really important, right? And recognizing that there is a difference between tokenization and representation. There's a difference between tokenization and being the first one, right, to break that boundary or do whatever you're asking them to do. And so being really intentional and cognizant of that, but also to Sina's point and my point here, like you say you want help. And so accept the help if people are willing to offer it. Yeah. Thank you for that.
I think we have time for one more question if someone has one. Dina, do you have any final thoughts?
I have a lot of those really practical resources for folks, and I've been trying to find them as we've been talking. So I haven't probably done the best in like, oh, here's my action plan for you all. But if you have questions, if you have thoughts, please feel free to reach out. I think that we all are in community together, and I think it's really important to be sharing. And I'm happy to share my thoughts, my templates, my whatever resources that I've gathered, because I think it's really important to work together in these spaces. The other thing that I will say for you all in particular here at the end of the discussion is the slide deck that I have, like, I encourage you to go through the slide deck, because again, there were a lot of things that I have specifically at the end, right, that are talking about thoughts and next steps. Principles of Emergent Strategy from Adrienne Marie Brown being one of them, tips for thinking about how to succeed in this work, the work that individuals and organizations want to do. So there are, we'll just call it like bonus material in those slide decks that might be really helpful in terms of practical terms as well. All right. And then let me turn it over to you, Julie, or turn it back to you. I know that you've got some things you want to say here at the end too.
Yes. Thank you, Dina, so much for your time and your thought in putting this program together. It's something that, you know, it's kind of a constant conversation that we're having, and it's a really great to be able to have these conversations with one another. And hopefully through this program, you all have found ways that maybe you can think about your role a little bit differently in how you can control, influence, or invest in strategic changes in the museum field related to DEAI. Just briefly to wrap up, I'm going to just share my screen so we can give you a little more information about IMP and how to get involved. We're going to have in the chat, we're going to throw that contact spreadsheet link back in the chat, if you would, Julia, so that if you are interested in sharing your information, we will be sending out a follow-up email. And if Dina has some of these resources that she's going to pull together, we will send that out if you've got your name and have opted into that through that communications list. Also, there's opportunities for you to indicate whether you'd like to volunteer or be part of our mailing list. So to be part of IMP officially, you have to be a member of AM, but it's really easy to join. It's just part of the checking in on your profile. And if you have any questions about it, Joanna and I are the co-chairs of the programming committee, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. And let's see. Where am I?
Well, you can find us online and through our relatively newly acquired social media channels. So please check us out and like and follow and all that good stuff on our webpage, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. If you're looking for more ways to get involved, please do express your interest in volunteering on the Google Sheet. send your program ideas to Julie or I via email, or join our biobank. You could be highlighted in a future IMP newsletter. We'll put the link to that in the chat as well.
So we've got some upcoming events later this month in a couple of weeks. We have Dine and Discuss Navigating the Pandemic as Consultants and Independent Museum Professionals. This is part of the National Council on Public History Conference. It'll be on Tuesday, March 25th. But you can register for that. And then also at AAM 2021 virtual conference, which is both on May 24th and June 7th through 9th. IMP is going to be co-sponsoring a program called Ethical Contracting. Is your museum doing it? And this is for both IMPs and museum leaders or staff. What we wanted to do is just kind of look at both sides of the equation about that relationship between consultants and the museums that they work for, and how to make sure that that relationship is fair and equitable. We don't exactly know what day and time that will be, but just stay tuned. We'll also have some other events related to the AAM virtual conference, hopefully some networking things. So just be on the lookout for that. And we have some resources that are new to our website, which is accessed via AAM's website if you look at their professional networks. One of them is the business of being an IMP, a webinar we did about 1.5 years ago. That recording is now available on the website, along with the slides and some additional resources if you're getting started or want to see what other people recommend. And then also new to our website is the Principles of Professional Practice, which is some guidelines as an IMP that you may want to consider. And then finally, we would like to know what you thought of this program. So we're going to put a link for the survey in the chat. This will also go out in the follow-up email, and we'd love for you to respond and just let us know your thoughts about this program, and also what you envision for some of our future programs. We'd appreciate your input. And that's all we got. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Dina, for your time and your expertise and your thoughts. We really appreciate it. And we will see you all at our next event.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.